Hi, my name is James. Welcome to King's Fine Woodworking. Today I'm going to show you step by step exactly how we built this coffee table. I'll go in great detail in case you want to build one for yourself or use any of the elements of this project for a project of your own. As with anything, we're going to start with some lumber and a rough sketch of what we're looking for. We've got Pacific Coast quilted maple and walnut. I generally hand draw a sketch of what we have in mind and kind of go from there. The first type of wood we have here is Pacific Coast quilted maple. This and the walnut both happen to be rough stock. I didn't have any of this in already surfaced material, but that's okay. I like to start out by cutting this stuff about 5 to 6 inches longer, each board, than I actually need it. And after it's fully milled, I will cut it down to the exact length at that point. Since lumber is rough, we have to follow a specific order of operations in order to get this down to perfectly square. And we're going to start off by face jointing one face, or surfacing one face. We need one face completely flat, and we do that on the jointer. You can see that's really nicely figured wood there. Sometimes it'll take a couple of passes to get down through the roughness. It just depends on how big of a cut you take each pass and how rough the wood really is. I should mention, if this is a project you're interested in, there's a link to the plans in the description below. During the surfacing, we found a crack on one of the faces, and it's actually caused the wood to separate just a little bit right at the top. But the crack doesn't go all the way through. It only goes through, and this only goes in about a third of the way. So I'm going to use 5-minute epoxy, and I'll let this sit up here. I'm going to dabble some in, and I'm going to just kind of try to press it down into the crack. I don't want to separate the crack any further in this case because it actually doesn't go very deep. I'm using this West Systems G5 5-minute epoxy. And I have a link to that in the description down below if you decide you want to get yourself some. I'm going to put a tiny little bit of clamp pressure on here to bring it back into where I think it needs to be. And then we're going to let this sit up for about an hour, even though it's 5-minute epoxy. And then I'll take the clamps off at that time. And then I'll let it sit overnight before I sand it. This is the next day, the next morning, with me doing some sanding. But in the meantime, we're going to jump over and try to cut the legs. This is 12-quarter walnut that I'm using for the legs. Once again, I'm going to cut it several inches, each leg, several inches longer than I need it to be. We'll do any surfacing that needs to be done, millwork, stuff like that, and then we're going to cut it to exact length at the end. This stuff is already surfaced on two sides, so it's just the two edges that I need to joint. And we'll joint one and we'll cut the other one square on the table saw. But take a look at that. I think it's pretty good looking. Didn't take very much at all to square that up. If you enjoy watching our videos, we'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. All you have to do is push the subscribe button down below and click that notification icon. It doesn't cost you a thing, and it really helps our channel grow. Once one edge is jointed, we'll take it over to the table saw. We will cut the other edge to width with the table saw using the jointed edge as a reference surface against the fence. And this makes those two faces parallel to each other, and we know we've got perfect 90-degree cuts. Then we'll just rotate each of those legs 90 degrees, cut the other edge off, and we have a perfectly square leg at that point. We're actually building this coffee table because I had a couple of members from our King's Fine Woodworking community on Facebook reach out and ask if I've ever built a coffee table because they wanted to see one. If you're on Facebook and you're interested, I'll put a link in the description down below. It's a great community, and it's just woodworkers. It's a private group, and you can see what others are doing. You can share your work. You can get insider tips and tricks, and it's just a good place to be. Alright, so I'm cutting some wenge to act as some decorative strips in the top surface of the table. And wenge is a beautiful wood. It's a very hard, exotic wood. It comes from Central Africa. And it's very, very dark. Once it has any kind of finish, it's almost nearly black, but you can still see some grain pattern in it, which is pretty cool. The strip is going to consist of a couple of pieces of wenge, a wider one and a narrow one, separated by a thin piece of maple in between them. And so I'm resawing the wenge down here to get some thinner strips out of that. And then we're going to jump over and mill some maple down as well. Now the reason for these decorative strips is because the quilted maple grain pattern is so highly figured that no two pieces are even remotely similar. So if I join two pieces together, there seems to be a very abrupt line and abrupt change between where one board ends and the next board begins, and it sometimes looks unnatural. And so one way of dealing with that is to separate them, and you can just separate them by putting any sort of a decorative strip or a wood of some contrasting color in between those two boards and highlight that separation, and that breaks up the grain pattern from the board on the left to the board on the right, and it just gives a little bit better of a look to it overall. It's not so jarring to see two pieces of quilted maple side by side. Alright, so now we have to plane them down once we've milled them or surface the top, and we have to finish milling them by planing them down to the correct thickness. And it takes several passes here because we've got to get them pretty thin. I think we decided on a piece that's about 5/8 wide wenge, then a piece of maple that's about a half, and then another piece of wenge that's about an 1/8. And those three pieces together will add up to make one strip, and we're going to put one strip in between each of the two joints on the tabletop. You'll see that a little bit more as we get going. And there's our 1/8. So you see we're just about done with that. So pretty thin strip. And now since it's an exotic and it's a little bit oily, I did clean these off with acetone, which takes the surface oils off of it so that the glue will bond and hold really well. So anytime you deal with exotic lumber, if you're not sure about the lumber, it's a good idea to prep the surface of the wood by using acetone and taking the oils off. Some species are very oily, like Paduke, for example, and you're not going to get a good finish on them or get them to glue together at all unless you get that oil off the surface first, and acetone is the best way to do that. So we did that with these, and this is what the decorative strip here is going to look like. These three pieces of wood are going to join together as if they're a solid piece, and they're going to separate two of our tabletop boards. So I'm going to clamp them to my assembly table, which is kind of a reference table. It's dead flat. There's a video on how I built it if you're curious. It's a great reference surface to attach things to, clamp things to, and build on. So we let that set up for a couple of hours. I actually used some quick set glue. It sets up in about 15 minutes. You can take the clamps off that quick, but we let it sit for a couple hours usually, especially when dealing with exotics. And there's the completed strip. We just need to sand it down, and then we'll have to it'll need some further milling in the future because we made it taller than it actually needs to be. It's going to go in a vertical orientation like this to separate those boards, so the tabletop is actually really thick. So we do want to kind of mill this down and get everything nice and square before we get going. And that's how those stripes will look in the tabletop. Okay, now we're going to resume milling the maple top. If you remember, we had to stop to epoxy that crack together. If you recall, we did the face jointing or surfacing of one face of the maple to make it flat. Now we're putting that reference face down and cutting the top face with the planer into parallel with the bottom face. And at the same time, we're going to push these two strips through because we want them to be the same thickness. I'm going to gradually mill all these down to the thickness that we want. It just takes multiple passes to get down to where we need. Take a little bit at a time. So after we have two faces that are parallel to each other, we're going to put either one of those against the fence because those are now reference surfaces, and we're going to joint an edge. This brings the edge into perfect square with those two faces. This is the third step in the milling process. And there they are. And this is kind of a quick look at what they're going to look like when the table goes together. and it kind of breaks up that grain pattern a little bit, and I think it looks nice. Now, of course, the final step in milling is actually to cut the board to width. The edge that we just jointed a minute ago is against the fence. That's our reference edge. And then we'll cut the other edge to become parallel with the reference edge, and also consequently to be the exact width that we're looking for. And now everything is milled down fully and cut to width. It's time to do our glue up. Now I have a lot of hands here helping, so we're going to go ahead and tackle all 5 boards at once for this glue up, but a lot of people are just in the shop by themselves, and if that's the case, you'll need to break this up. The logical breakup would be to just handle the middle 3 boards first, let that cure and dry, and then attach the other 2 boards to that during a second glue up. So it just depends on how fast you are and whether or not you have help. One person can certainly do everything, but it is a little bit quicker and a little bit easier to handle bigger chunks at a time if you have help. So we just make sure that we glue all the surfaces. So what Titebond actually recommends is what they tell us to do. And I have those all clamped together very, very lightly right now. And I'm going to use these boards as cawls. I'm going to wrap them in some plastic wrap so that the glue doesn't stick to them. And these will help hold this table flat, so I can put a whole lot of pressure on the other clamps and really squeeze this stuff together tight. This is another thing that takes several people to do all at once really quickly because the glue is starting to set up. This is actually a relatively quick set glue. I don't think you would necessarily use that if it's just one person. And then however many clamps you have on the bottom, you need to be close to that number on the top as well in order to keep the forces pulling even. If you just had them on the bottom, it would tend to want to cup the board down. If you just had them on the top, it would tend to want to cup the board up. So if you can alternate like this, then you make it a little more even. All right, so once that's all dried the next day, I know that was very abrupt, I was talking too fast, too much, then we'll go ahead and take them off. And hopefully, your cawls don't stick. You'll probably only make the mistake once of not wrapping it with plastic wrap like I did. I don't know, I might have made the mistake twice, but then it just tears off your wood. All right, and then we will use a paint scraper to remove the extra glue. And you don't have to scrape too hard. Just get a regular paint scraper. That's all it is. Is what I saw Norm Abram used 30 years ago, and that's what I've always used since then, and it just works fantastic. All right, since these the edges are pretty wild here, I'm going to go ahead and start somewhere. And I've got to square this off because we want our coffee table to have a nice, even, neat, square edge to it. So I'm just picking a point to do that. It was a little too light, I couldn't quite see it, so we're going to hit that up again. There we go. And I'm going to use a track saw to cut that off. You could use a circular saw, however you want to do it. Track saw does make it really nice and even. This happens to be one of Festool's, probably one of their best tools. I think this and maybe the sanders are just pretty phenomenal. I'm not really sure they're worth the price, but they do make a perfect cut, especially when that plastic strip there is new, like it is in this case. There's no burn, and this is end grain, which is pretty amazing because even with a new table saw blade, I was still burning, the long grain on the sides. But as soon as I have this cut, I'm going to go ahead and just spray some lacquer on it because I don't want any checking or anything to develop over the next few days while I'm working on it. That's optional, but I just don't know if there's any moisture in there. There didn't seem to be. We checked it, but just in case, I'm going to put some lacquer on the edge, and that's going to stop any checking because it's going to make water move very slowly through there. And then we're going to want to go ahead and work on sanding it down. I like to start with a belt sander, and I mark everything up with a pencil first, and I just basically sand to remove the pencil marks. If I've removed the pencil marks in an area, I don't keep sanding in that area. That's how we keep the sanding uniformly going down. If you sand too long in any one area, you're no longer going to have a tabletop that feels flat and smooth everywhere. It's going to have ridges in it. It's going to, it's going to go up and down, and valleys and hips all along it. So you definitely don't want to do that. All right, so while that is being sanded, I am going to jump on starting to make the legs. And we've got the same process here in milling. These are actually the rails, not the legs, sorry, but the lower part of the table. Same steps in milling here as we had before. Step 1 of milling is surfacing or face jointing. We need one totally flat face before we can continue. And we need to do that with all of our boards before we go to the planer. Alright, so if you remember, step number 2 is we're going to put that reference surface that we just flattened down against the bed of the planer, and we're going to mill the top. We're going to get the top milled down such that it's perfectly parallel with the bottom so that we have 2 parallel faces. That's step 2 of all milling operations. And we're going to do that for all of our pieces. Step 3, of course, is to joint one edge. Remember, the 2 flats are now parallel to each other, so they can both act as a reference surface. So now we're going to do step 3 here, which is milling the one edge, which is just jointing it on the jointer with the reference surface against the fence. And the final step is bringing the other edge into parallel with that previously jointed edge, which also happens to cut our piece to width. Now we have a piece of wood that is perfectly square, flat, and parallel all the way around. Remember, we did the legs earlier, and now with finishing the rails, this brings all of our walnut down to size. It's all been milled, so it's all flat, square, and parallel and ready to go. It's all longer than it needs to be, but all the other dimensions are done correctly. So we're going to start with the 4 legs, and it's important to mark these because that's going to help us know where we want the mortises. So I'm marking that this is the top front right leg, and I'm going to do that with each of the legs. At the top of it, I'm going to signify what leg it is and what faces the front, what faces the back, that type thing. And then I'm going to begin my layout. My layout is essentially I'm just taking the measurements that I have decided as to where I want my mortises to go for my rails, and I'm laying those out on the wood. Some people like a mechanical pencil. I like to start with just a sharp, regular wooden pencil, and I try to keep a few with me so that I can move to a new one as soon as it gets dull. And then I transfer from one to another, one leg to another that way. And I like to mark everything out with pencil because I'm not going to chisel these legs out. If I was, I would use a different type of marking tool. Something more like this. This will score a really thin line, which cuts the grain, the wood on the surface. So if I was to chisel this out, it would give me a nice clean edge. It just takes 3 or 4 light passes to score that. We're going to go ahead and mark that with a pencil so that we can see it, because we are going to cut our mortises out with a hollow chisel mortiser. But I'm going to show a video probably next week on several different ways to make a mortise and tenon joint, depending on what equipment you have, but they can be done with pretty much anything. And so now I've got everything all laid out. I've got the mortises for the upper rails and for the lower rails. And I have the boards marked in the right orientation. The arrows are pointing towards the table, not away from the table. And I have that same thing marked on the top of all 4 of them, so everything's in the right orientation. And then we're just going to use our hollow chisel mortiser, set it up, and drill out these square holes. The drill bit starts, it drills down a little bit, and then the press action of this press of the hollow chisel mortiser will push that square chisel all the way through. And does a pretty good job. It's very, very fast. The only thing it doesn't do is make absolutely perfect edges. But that's okay. I'm going to show you how we deal with that. It's definitely a neat tool and comes in handy. If you're making a blind mortise, like one that doesn't go all the way through, it's great because the shoulder of the tenon is going to hide the only edge of the mortise that there is. So if it's a little rough, it doesn't make any difference. But if you're going to do a through mortise like we're doing, we're mortising all the way through the board, then we do have to do a little bit of cleanup at the end to clean up that edge, because you can see it's not real neat yet, but we'll fix that. So there's the top ones. The mortises are all fully cut, and we want to check and make sure we did everything correctly with our plan, or at least in our mind, make sure we've done everything right. And now it's time to do some cleanup here. There are a few tools that could conceivably work for this. You could even wrap sandpaper around a stick and sand it to get a little bit flatter. That might take quite a while. A lot of people would go to a rasp. A rasp is a dedicated tool towards carving and shaping wood. They're fairly expensive, and they're all very aggressive. So I don't think I would use a rasp in this case, because it would just take off too much material all at once. So I need something that's, kind of somewhere in between those. And I'm actually going to go to a file. Files are typically for metalwork, but they work just fine for woodworking too. This is a square file. It's 90 degrees on the corner, which is really nice because that's going to get in there, and that is going to help us keep our corners and edges nice and square. You can see here from this little miniature square, it's basically just a square. And we just go back and forth in there and kind of clean up this area, and it will make the front edge of this nice and neat. And so when our tenon sticks out, there won't be big gaps. It won't look, ugly and chunky and like we made lots of mistakes. It'll really clean it up nicely. It's quick, it's easy, and one square will do the job. And that's what it looks like when it's all done there, compared to one that hasn't been touched at all yet. So pretty quick. It takes about 2-3 minutes to clean that edge up, and it works a lot better than a rasp. And when you're done, just make sure you get something like a file card. It's something that you can clean the wood dust off of this with, because you don't want these files to rust, and the wood might have moisture in it. So before you put them away, just clean them off. I'll have links to these things in the description down below in the event that you want to get something like this. I'm not saying a woodworker doesn't need rasps. I'm saying you don't necessarily need a rasp for this particular job. All right, now we're going to turn our attention to the tenons. All the rails that we have that hold the legs together have to be cut. The tenons have to be cut on them. And for that, there's really no better job than a table saw sled. And we make a table saw sled that also works as a tenoning sled, because the zero clearance inserts at the top move apart, move together, just so that it fits perfectly no matter how wide your blade is, whether it's a standard cutting blade or a dado blade of any width. So the first thing I'm going to do is I measured to get the approximate depth that I think I need to cut to, and then I'm just going to quickly cut both sides of a scrap piece. This is another reason why I left my wood several inches long, and plus I even cut a spare. Because I have milled those down to exactly 3/4, so that's how I know this will work. And I'm just going to do a quick test fit. So that test fit is really good. I've got some friction there. It's not too much, so it's not difficult to push in. And so I think that's nice. So the next thing I'm going to do is do a test fit that's the whole depth, because it might have fit fine really shallow, but the whole depth might be too tight. It turns out I was lucky this time, and this one does work, but oftentimes it won't, and you will need to take a little more material off. Now that I've established my depth of cut, I am going to go ahead and make the face cuts, also called the face cheek cuts, on all of the rails, on all of the tenons here. These are the short rails, and we're going to make the top and bottom cuts, which are called the edge cuts, later, because I'm going to have to change the depth for that. And those pieces have already been cut to length. Here's one of the long rails. And one of the reasons I left them long is because if I mess up a tenon, then I can go back and cut that off and do it again. But now that I know that tenon's worked out just fine, I'll go ahead and take my measurement, and I will cut this to exact length. Once I've cut it to length, I can go ahead and put the tenon on the other side. Once again, I'm just cutting the face cheeks of the tenon for this operation. Then I'll turn the board vertical, and I'll cut the edge or edge cheeks afterward. But I will be needing to adjust the depth for some of those. It's just easier to do everything in bulk once and just change the blade depth one time. And if you get our sled, we actually sell these plans for these sleds, but we also sell the entire sled in a box, ready to go. You just do a little bit of assembly, square it, and it's good to go. You don't have to do any of the building process whatsoever. It makes it very, very easy to make tenons, along with a whole host of other things. It's a pretty good sled. All right, so there's one of the long rails. It's all done there up to that point. And now I'm cutting the edge cheeks, as you can see. I've adjusted the depth same way I did before. I used my my gauge. I marked the depth, did a test cut, made sure it fit. And we got to do this on both sides. Luckily, the stop there works perfectly and helps us keep everything perfectly aligned. That's the nice thing about doing tenons on a table saw sled. Makes it super easy. And we'll do a little fit here and take a look at it. Might be a little bit snug. Let's see. That little tap and it went down, so that's good. You don't want it too snug because then you can't really get glue on it and compress it. Sometimes it'll come back to bite you. But that looks pretty good. You can see that it's got good friction. It's holding itself in place. And it's all set. So now we're going to do the layout for the hole. There's going to be a hole in these long tenons because I'm going to make a tusk tenon. This is going to be a through tenon, goes all the way through, and a tusk goes in through the edge to hold it in place. It kind of draws the rail in really tight to the leg. So I'll lay those all out, and then we'll take them over to the mortiser and cut them out. You can also just drill some holes and chisel it square as well. That's pretty simple to do. But don't decide not to build this project because you don't have a mortiser. A mortiser is not necessary. It's just a tool to speed things up, like most tools in the shop. And I'm going to show you in the next video that mortiser is completely unnecessary. So there's that. This goes in place. And this is the little tusk that we've cut. This one may be a little bit tight. Let's test it. See here. Now it looks pretty good to me. Alright, and we're just going to cut a whole bunch of these. I've just got a little scrap piece of maple here. I just like the contrast of maple and walnut. I think they look really good together. We'll just trace a bunch, cut them out with a bandsaw, and then sand them to fit. I didn't really want to change the blade on my bandsaw for this small number of cuts because I've got a big job coming up where I need this wider blade, so I'll just get them close with this. These won't necessarily follow the curve exactly, but it's very easy to sand them to fit with the belt sander. We're just going to sand them down to the line. And we can be aggressive with it. I think I've got like a 36 grit belt in here, so that's no problem. May have a few burn marks, but we'll take that out in just a second. Next, we'll just jump over to the random orbit sander and sand them down so that they're nice and smooth. Take away all those scratches from the belt sander. And I may knock off the corners with the hand plane. That way it's not sharp. Be careful not to run your fingers along the plane. Of course, you'd cut yourself. Maybe just do this with the sander. If you're not sure, if you don't have one, no big deal. Then we'll test fit it, and it's important to know that the hole that this tusk goes through actually extends backwards inside of the mortise a little bit, because as we drive this down, it is going to pull the tenon and consequently the whole rail forward until it's nice and tight. And if you get the plans, you'll see exactly what I mean, but the hole goes behind the face of the leg, just a little bit. And that way it'll force that leg force the rail forward. So I'm going to take the leg back to the chop saw, set up a little stop, and cut a chamfer all the way around the bottom of the leg. I think it'll add a nice aesthetic look to the leg itself. And then we're going to take the time to sand everything. Assembly will be very soon, and we want to get all the sanding done before we do our assembly. So we'll start with probably 120 grit, and we'll go down to about 220 grit when it's all said and done. We don't need to go any finer than that. The edges here, I do want to take probably 220 or 240 and just knock the corners off. I want a really fine grit for this because I don't want to change it. I want a corner. I just don't want it to be sharp. I want to put a big bevel on the bottom of my tabletop now that it's done. And I do that with a little jig that I've created that basically mounts to the fence on my table saw. And I have a couple of big roller guides to hold it in place. The one on the left is made by Bow Products. They make the bow fence. It's really good. And the one on the right was sent to me by VAD Concepts. And I'm going to put a link to their website in the description below. And it's actually a really good roller guide. It's taller than most of the ones that I've seen before, and the rollers themselves are on springs, so it gives a nice amount of tension and allows a little bit of flex, just exactly what would be necessary. And it really shines on the bandsaw for resawing wide boards. And this is the other long side that we're cutting at this point here. And it actually cut pretty good. I was surprised with no burns with this highly figured wood, especially being maple. It usually it's very prone to burning, but overall it did a pretty good job. And now we're going to turn this up on end, and we're going to cut the two ends. And for that, my jig that holds the wood in place actually slides also along the fence. So in this case, I'm actually going to clamp it to the guide itself here. You'll see how this works. And we'll just slide this whole thing along the fence. I've got a weight on the back of the jig, which holds it down tight to the table. And it keeps this board perfectly vertical. It makes it very easy to cut big bevels. We just put a few squeeze clamps on to hold it snugly to the jig. And then we can make that cut. And even with all that weight on it, the board itself and the weight on the backside, it still cuts pretty easily. And there's that side. I just think a big bottom bevel looks nice on a thicker tabletop. You don't always want the whole thickness of the edge showing. And it adds a nice design element to the piece. One last thing I need to do on those tenons, the through tenons, which will come all the way through and hold the Tusk Tenon through them, is I need to sand the edges. They're a little bit rough, and I like that roughness for the glue, but the piece that sticks through needs to be smoother because that piece is obviously going to be seen, and so we're going to do that here before we do our glue up. And it just takes a second with a random orbit sander. And then I'm going to clamp them in my vise, and I'm going to put a little bevel on these edges. You could do that with a sander if you don't have a hand plane, but if you do have a hand plane, just all you really need is a little block plane, and it puts these bevels on so easily, and they're nice and crisp and clean, and it looks really nice when they protrude through to have that nice bevel. It gives just a nice finished detail to the piece. And the one other thing that I need to do is put a groove in them. This groove is going to hold a clip which allows me to attach the tabletop to the rails. And it's going to allow a little bit of expansion and contraction, a little bit of movement, which is important, so the piece never cracks. And I've just got a start and stop point there on the router table. And there's the groove, as easy as that, just a 1/4 inch cutter. And here's a little cleat that I will make on the bandsaw. Fits right in there. It's a little bit shy of the top, which is what we want. So when I screw a screw up through there into the tabletop, it will pull the rail up tight to the tabletop. And there we go. Here's all of our pieces. Now we are getting ready to assemble the base to our coffee table. They're all marked and identified, and I know which piece goes where, and that's important. So you might be wondering why I'm gluing this up, because after all, it is a Tusk Tenon type of construction, so I don't actually have to glue it together. We can just assemble it, hammer those tusks into place, and it'll just stay. I've got a dining table that's built just like that. I have a few other pieces of furniture where this is going that have this Tusk Tenon. However, I will never take this table apart. It's very small, fits easily through my doorways, and I'm doing the Tusk Tenon more for the looks than for the convenience of being able to assemble and disassemble it, so I'm going to go ahead and glue it together. Certainly isn't necessary. You could do it so it's a knockdown type of a build, so you could take it apart whenever you need. And that's one of the ones that was just a tiny bit tight, so I've got to use my clamp here to kind of squeeze it together and get those shoulders lined up nice and tight. But anyway, I just think that I'm matching my other pieces, and I don't mind if it's glued together. If you build this project, you can certainly choose whether or not you want to glue it up or whether or not you want to just have it so that you can disassemble it whenever you need to. Both options are equally good options. In fact, even working from our plans, if you decided not to have the tenon come all the way through and have a through tenon, you could just have a blind mortise where the tenon just goes in about halfway and it doesn't protrude through, and that's a very nice look also, and it's just very easy to do. There's a lot of options that you can take and pick and choose when you're building a piece like this. So what we're essentially doing here is we are building the two ends first, putting them together with glue. We're getting off all the excess glue with a straw, which we kind of cut to a 45-degree point, helps scrape the glue out of the corners, and then wiping it down with a damp rag a little bit. And once the two end segments are put together, we're going to take the long rails and glue that in place, and then put the other end on that. So obviously I have to have somebody standing up on the table to get this part of the job done. And in case anyone's curious, that is Titebond Dark, which is perfect for gluing up walnut, because if there are any glue lines showing, it dries the same color as walnut and it looks great. And I'm just doing everything all at once. I'm leaving the clamps on. This is the bottom long rail. This bottom long rail is held in differently than the others because I want the bottom shelf to be smaller than the top. So this bottom rail actually comes on the inside of the leg, whereas the top rail goes in the middle of the leg, and of course the tabletop goes over the leg. But I want this inside because I want it smaller. If somebody pulls the table up next to them while they're sitting on the couch, maybe to lean over and read or eat or something like that, I want room for their feet to go underneath the tabletop. So I'm making the bottom shelf narrower than the tabletop itself. After the glue up has sat overnight, we're going to go ahead and remove the clamps and move on to the next step. Lots of clamps. You got to have lots of clamps to do some of these projects. And remember that those two long lower rails, which is kind of the front and back of the coffee table there, those are just held in by glue from the sides and from the end. But before I get to that, I am going to go ahead and try to sand the whole project. Again, we sanded it before we did assembly, but I need to sand around everywhere where I put that glue just to make sure I get it cleaned off. Now I'm going to switch to my Milwaukee drill here because I'm going to put these pins in. And this is kind of an offset head for the Milwaukee drill. And this allowed me to get very close to an edge to drill a hole, which is convenient because if I use the regular head of the drill, I wouldn't get this close to the edge and I'd have to angle it, and I don't think that would look very good. So I'm not even really going to mark a specific point. I'm just going to put two holes in, and I'm going to drill all the way through the rail and about halfway or a third of the way, whatever, through the leg itself. I'll put one low and one high. And then I'm going to take an oak dowel. I just want a strong hardwood dowel. Maple would have been great, but I don't have any maple, so it's an oak dowel. And glue it up and then just hammer it home. And that is going to lock this in for life. Now I would probably have had a different joinery method if I did want this to be a disassemblable table, but it's not. I glued it, and so I don't mind doing this. Now once those are in, I'll put a playing card down so I don't scratch the surface with the offset teeth of my saw, and I'll cut those off. Now the teeth aren't offset very much here because this is a saw that's almost a flush cut saw, but I purposely put that in place so that I didn't scratch the walnut. And we'll just sand those guys smooth, and that's it. We'll do those on both sides of the rail. Now I'm cleaning the whole thing off with isopropyl alcohol. What this is going to do is going to tell me if I have any glue stains that I missed, because they're going to stay white, very light colored, because they're not going to absorb the alcohol. And I'll see that right away. You can see a couple of little spots right there. And I'll go back and I'll sand those off. And I'll test it with the alcohol again, make sure I get the alcohol to absorb, and it does. That's good. It's just a quick way to check for glue spots, because once you put the finish on, it's too late. You don't want those showing. All right, so I'm going to use Osmo Poly X oil for the finish. It's a hard wax oil. It's a really, really good finish. Although I don't often follow their exact directions, I find that sometimes I get a little bit better results doing things a tiny bit differently. They say you can just take a rag and put a very thin, small amount on it and just wipe on a thin coat, and you certainly can. That does work well. But I want a lot to soak in. I've sanded this wood to between 180 and 220. I can't recall exactly here, but I've left it just a teeny tiny bit rough, and it's going to allow more oil to absorb. So I'm going to put it on pretty thick, and that's what I did with the brush. Once I've done that, I'm going to go back with a microfiber cloth and wipe the excess off. I've let it sit for about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to go back and wipe the excess off. And that gives a really good finish. We'll actually let that dry for a day, and we'll give it a second coat, pretty much the same way. Now we'll turn our attention back to the tabletop, and I want to put a chamfer along the top of the tabletop. It'll match the big chamfer at the bottom, but it's just a small chamfer, a small decorative edge here to dress it up a little bit. And we'll work this all the way around. And then we want to sand it, get rid of those burn marks. And I'll keep wiping it off with the microfiber cloth, make sure I don't have any burn marks. It's hard to tell when there's dust in the way, so you do have to wipe it. And then we're going to go ahead and put the Osmo on this as well. So I'm going to put it on really thick and just spread it around. Again, this isn't really Osmo's directions, but I want a lot of absorption here, and this works great. I've done dozens of tables like this, and I love the way the finish looks. Once I get it pretty much covered everywhere, I'm still going to leave the bulk of this excess on. And then I'm going to take a Scotch-Brite, like a 3M pad, the white pad, which is essentially no grit, and I'm going to buff it with that, with a buffer, an electric buffer, and that is going to smooth the surface just a little bit of the wood, and it's going to help push some of this finish into the wood surface. I have tables I've finished like this with just a single coat, and they've seemed to last forever, although I will put a double coat on this. But this really does a very good job at getting deep penetration of this hard wax oil finish. And we'll go back and forth several times to get it to penetrate in to the fibers of the wood nicely. You can see that that's causing it to drive into the wood instead of just sitting on the top, which is nice. We'll let that dry for a few minutes and come back and do the same thing. We'll take a microfiber cloth and wipe off all the excess. Give it a little bit of a hand buffing there. And I've already done the bottom. We always do the bottom of every piece first. I do the bottom and the sides of the table, and then I do the top and the sides again. And you can see this maple has just beautiful, amazing 3D grain. Quilted maple. I really like this stuff. All right, this is the shelf piece. I milled these at the same time I was milling everything else. They're exactly 3/4 of an inch thick. And I've cut these 4 pieces to be oversized, a little bit bigger than what we wanted. It's the same type of maple, although the figure in this is a little more curly than it is quilted, but it still has nice figure. And this is just a normal glue up. There's nothing abnormal or different here. I just want to make sure I get good glue coverage on it. And once again, these pieces are longer than they need to be for me to trim them square at the end. And we'll follow the same essential procedure here. We're going to put these clamps on very lightly and then put clamps across the top. Remember, they have to oppose each other, one up, one down, one up, one down, so neither one tends to warp the frame or tends to warp the tabletop. But those are on lightly for now until I can get the cawls in. Once I get the cawls in and get those secured, then we can really cinch down these long parallel clamps there. And we're going to let that dry overnight as well. Now I'm going to jump over and start cutting those cleats. These are the things that are going to hold the tabletop to the rails. This could be really any design or any shape that you want. They even make metal ones, but I just wanted wood since everything else is wood. In fact, these do have to be screwed in, so this is the only metal that's going to be in the whole table is going to be the screws that hold these things in place. And you can batch cut them like this, get a whole bunch done at once. After that, I will put them in a little squeeze clamp to hold them. I'll drill a hole that's just a tiny bit bigger than the threads of the screw that I'm going to use, so my screw passes through it easily. Then do a little bit of a countersink so that my screw will sit flush, and that's it. Just got to build a whole bunch of those, and then I'll sand them so they're relatively smooth, and that was that. Alright, it's been 24 hours, so we're going to pull this off. If you've made it this far in the video, I'm very impressed. And don't forget about joining our Facebook group if you're on Facebook. And if you want to help support the channel, we do have a Patreon page. There'll be a link to that in the description down below. In fact, half of all the projects that we pick and choose were requested by Patreon members, so we usually try to build whatever they request. Okay, same glue scraper here. We're going to scrape off that excess glue. We're going to mark up the board with our pencil just like we did before and proceed through the same sanding steps. First we'll hit it lightly with the belt sander, and then we're going to jump over to the random orbit here and sand it down the rest of the way, and we're going to take it down to about 220 grit. Now we're going to jump back to the large table. We are going to go through a series of grits here because I really want to have a polished look. We're going to start at 400. We're going to go 400, 600, 800, 1000, then 2000, 3000, and 4000. That combined with the hard wax oil is going to give us a glass-like finish on the top of this table. It's going to be ultra smooth. We just have to work through the grits, and it doesn't take long. Probably about a minute of grit. 2 minutes of grit, something like that. Doesn't take very long at all. You see it's kind of whitish when we start sanding here, and it just gets deeper and darker in color as we get up through the grits. We've gone through the first 4. Now we're hitting 2000 grit. And it's already looking better. I wish you could feel this. Unfortunately you can't, since here on the other end of the computer there. And this will be the last grit here. It's 4000 grit. We'll go over the whole thing lightly with this. They just make a really, really big difference in the finish of a piece. This tabletop has already had 2 coats of the Poly-X, and this is what we're doing after the fact. And it's just glass smooth. Really incredible finish. The pictures don't really do it justice, but it's a very nice finish. Okay, so we're going to take the cleats and we're going to just spray them with some lacquer. I don't want them to be bare wood. We'll give them a couple of coats on all sides, and we'll do the same thing with the Tusk Tenons here. Spray them with some lacquer as well. Now we're going to jump back to the bottom shelf, and we are going to cut it to size. This cut's going to produce some burns, I'm guessing, and that's okay because I have allowed for that much extra width in my cut so that I can take it to the jointer and give it one final pass on the jointer to get rid of those burn marks. And we'll do a little test fit here to see how it looks. And it fits perfectly. Right into place. Let's make sure we can get it all the way through there. And perfect. That's great. And now we're going to go ahead and cut it to length. We'll use the same technique, use the track saw. We'll see if we get any burns here. We didn't on the tabletop, so hopefully that does the same thing here. And it did great. Not the end of the world if you get burns. You can always sand them off, but sure is nice when you don't have to. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and chamfer the top of this to match the tabletop itself. And I've put little marks there where the legs are because I don't want to chamfer up against the leg. I don't want there to be a groove there. I want this to be straight up and down next to the leg, and I want the chamfer to be in the other areas. And the chamfer, unfortunately, is going to put a few burns, and we'll just have to sand those off. That's okay. And we want to make sure we'll do it all the way around. And we'll go through and sand it. This is the bottom side. It's not perfect like the top side. And we'll do something very similar here that we did to the top. I'm not going to go through all of the same steps that I did in the top with the sanding to get it ultra smooth. It's not that big a deal. It's always going to have stuff on it. No one's going to reach under here and feel it, and so it may be a tiny bit less smooth. So what I'm going to do in this case, instead of working it in with the 3M pad, the Scotch-Brite pad, I'm going to just put a buffer, wool buffer on it, and I'm going to work the finish in with the wool buffer. And we'll do that in a couple of coats as well, one each day. And now it is time to install the tabletop. So I've measured so it has the exact same amount of overhang on all sides. That's important. And I've marked the hole, the start of the hole, with a drill bit, and now I'm drilling it to the appropriate depth. It's a pretty thick tabletop here. It's about 1.6 inches, so there's no real risk in going through it. And this is just a standard, it's a deck screw, actually a ceramic coated deck screw. We use these for all of our woodworking because they're virtually indestructible. And we'll just secure this down snug, but not overly tight. You go overly tight, you're probably going to break the cleat. And it doesn't have to be all that tight. And then we're going to tap all these in. And we'll leave those there. I could glue those in, but for now I think I'll just put them in. Friction holds them in place really well, especially with the finish on it. And there's all the cleats in place for the top and for the bottom, as you can see. I put them every 6-8 inches. Probably could get away with half that many and it will work fine, but I just want to make sure we're set for life here. And there it is. That's the finished piece. Thanks for watching.